experiences and regions as well. So I think that all of you today will be able to learn and glean a lot from our panelists and their varied experiences. So I'm going to introduce Alex George first. Alex is a lifelong educator and work-based learning specialist. He is the former senior work-based learning manager for Chicago Public Schools, where he served for many years helping to build out their work-based learning programming and the infrastructure for scaling that. He recently joined Transio as a product and project manager in 2022. Additionally, we have Jerry Peacock with us. Jerry is the former principal in Baker City, Oregon, and former director of Baker Technical Institute, whose mission is to provide a next-generation education for the future of Eastern Oregonians. He is currently the CTE regional coordinator in Malheur County, Oregon, which is Eastern Oregon, covering 6 counties, 23 school districts, and 33,000 square miles in this rural environment. So before we launch into the questions with those introductions, I'd actually love for each of you to tell us a little bit more about the communities in which you've served and those actual regions so that we can really understand the context for this conversation. So Jerry, would you mind just kind of starting and telling us a little bit more about who you serve, where you serve, the community and the region?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure being here today. As Audrey alluded to, I'm in Eastern Oregon, and my territory that I cover for the ESD, Education Service District, is quite expansive, obviously. We have very, very small schools in our region. And so most of my schools have populations of less than 100 high school students, with several as many as 500 to 600. So total population of our students in the 23 school districts, 9 through 12, is about 2,000 students, which is considerably different than what many of you experience in your particular districts. So that's just a snapshot. What I do, where we are. As a CTE regional coordinator for the ESD, I work with programs in the schools that have programs of study and receive Perkins funding.
So 2,000 students across those 33,000 miles. You certainly have some specific challenges and a lot that we will be kind of going into through the course of this webinar. Alex, you have had a very different experience in a very different environment. So could you tell us a little bit more about the community in which you served and what that was like?
Yeah, Chicago Public Schools is one of the largest school districts in the nation. I think as of last year, we were overtaken by Miami-Dade. So now I think we're the 4th largest school district. We had some fluctuations in enrollment over the last couple of years. We have about anywhere from 14 to 16,000 CTE students, about 350,000 total students, and high schools, it's about 120. And then across all schools, we're getting into the hundreds. It's an extremely diverse population of students, although mostly underserved population and minority students. And, you know, obviously it's, as the senior work-based learning manager, I was tasked with both serving the CTE, but also district-wide. Small team, all about scaling, using technology to meet those needs. And as we'll get into it, although mainly our Perkins funding obviously focus on CT students, we found creative ways to impact non-CT students with funding to improve proficiency in career skills, put them on career pathways. But obviously a very urban school district, large population density, with students from just about every race, creed, nationality that you can imagine within the district itself.
Excellent. Thank you both for providing that context. And I'm hoping that our audience will really be able to understand kind of the different dynamics and how they can be applied to their current environments as well. So before we launch into this, a couple quick housekeeping things. So Jason will be reviewing and monitoring the chat throughout the course of the webinar. So please feel free to drop questions in throughout as they come to you, as you're thinking of them, as different kind of ideas are catalyzing them. Please feel free to kind of have those questions going. I'll pause between our questions and ask Jason if he has any questions for us. I'll also keep about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, just in case it comes to you after the fact or we don't have a chance to get to those questions during that kind of time frame. Additionally, we will have our panelists spotlighted. So myself, Jerry, and Alex will be spotlighted on your screen throughout this. So feel free to turn your cameras off if you'd like to, or keep them on, totally your preference. But you will not be visible to the majority of people during this session, other than a little tile. Also, please remember to mute yourself unless we're calling on you to ask a specific question, just so we can minimize that feedback while we're going through. All right, so to get us started, we have a couple poll questions to help us to better understand who our audience is and what your experiences have been thus far. So we'll start out with 2 poll questions, and then we're actually going to have a couple other spaces throughout so we can get more insight into who you are and how we can kind of tailor our conversation. All right, excellent. We've got about 50% participation so far on those poll questions. So if you haven't had a chance to respond yet, please get those in. 2 questions we're asking: have you ever applied for Perkins V funding before? And how familiar are you with the ways in which Perkins V funding can be used? All right, gonna take about 20 more seconds and then I'll close this out. All right, so of our 74 participants that responded, 54% have not applied. So only 31% have in the past. So we have a lot of folks here who have not applied for Perkins V funding in the past, which is excellent. We're going to give you tips and tools of how you might be able to access those funds. And how familiar are you with the ways in which Perkins V funding can be used? We have 51%, the majority of people that are somewhat familiar. 17% who feel you're very familiar, perhaps even experts, and 31% who are not familiar at all. So we have a pretty broad range, but I'd say most people are middle grounds with a little knowledge, but really here to expand that knowledge and better understand what's available to you. All right. Oh, I didn't share those results. Here we go. Here are those results. All right. So let's launch into that first question. So now that we have a better understanding of our audience, only about half have ever applied or considered applying for Perkins, about half have not, some familiarity. Alex, could you kick us off and tell us a little bit more about what the main elements of Perkins V funding should be used to support?
Yeah, we'll get into some of the creative ways in funding a little later in the discussion, but usually the main ways that you're going to use Perkins fundings is you can supplant current costs of your CT programs under specific parameters. A big one is purchasing CTE supplies, depending on what pathways or clusters you have in with your district. Anything from, the tools needed in an auto body shop to the farming equipment for your agricultural programs. You can support CTE programs as a whole, but you cannot focus that funding on individual students. So you're not funding individual students, you're funding the programs that are within. Obviously, that funding will flow to students, but it can't be targeting individual students. It has to be the program as a whole. You can do large-scale capital improvement programs. You can do classroom build-outs for specific pathways or clusters. But something that's very important to note is there are cascading levels of bureaucracy. You're going to have dictations by your state, sometimes your local county. In Chicago, the mayor has a lot of influence in how we're spending those funds, even if it's not written into law. She has a lot of influence over education policy. But something that you have to keep in mind are those cascading levels of bureaucracy and how they are going to want to dictate or at least funnel funds into specific areas.
Okay, so we have both the level of Perkins V funding and what that looks like from a federal level, but also then state requirements, some local needs, various things like that that are also layered into that. Is that right, Alex?
Perfectly reflected what I said, yes.
Yep. And now, Jerry, I know your experience is a little bit different. We've talked about kind of the region itself, the vast array of kind of space and areas that you cover. So I know that your experience is a little bit different in terms of how you utilize that Perkins V funding. So could you tell us a little bit more about what those main elements are of Perkins V funding that you use to support within your region?
Absolutely. Obviously, when you base Perkins funding on ADM, average daily membership, in rural parts of our country, you're going to get considerably less funding, so you have less dollars to spread over number of students that you have. So predominantly what we do with the funds in this region, we use our funds significantly in the area of professional development. So we really believe that we get a bigger bang for the buck if we can send staff members in our schools to get some further extensive training in what it is that they're trying to teach and get across to young people. The other thing that we use them for is to support what we're trying to do with career-connected learning. And career-connected learning in the state of Oregon is divided into 4 different avenues, which I won't go into unless asked to do so. But we really believe that we need to start focusing some of our dollars, and Perkins V allows us to go down into the middle school level more than the previous revisions have allowed. So we use those funds for some career-connected learning, and then we're also trying to expand effective work-based learning, which is a part of Perkins as well. So you're required to have a work-based learning component. So we're trying to determine ways to make that, to create some efficacy in that, and educate the teachers in our region as to what that really means. It's not just a superficial internship or practicum or some of those things. It's much more involved. So we use our funds for those primary areas. We don't have a lot of money that we can spend on equipment, but the state of Oregon has some other funding sources that supports us in those efforts. So, but I would say that, well, I know that the biggest majority of our funds are in the professional development area.
And so I see kind of the reasoning for that is so that you can amplify the impact. So knowing, and part of what I want our audience to hear is that the funding is going to be distributed differently. And we recognize that in rural areas, there needs to get more creative and think through how we amplify that impact. And so, Jerry, you're really leveraging the professional development aspect so that more people have the tools to then amplify that impact within the community, as well as ensuring that it's quality and aligned with what you know is going to really drive that work-based learning, the experiential learning, the career exploration, the elements that are going to help to create that pathway into careers.
Audrey, that's correct. And I will just add this, is that what we've also discovered is that one of our most understaffed areas when you're talking about career and technical ed is in the area of guidance. And we're talking about folks who truly understand how to direct young people in career opportunities. And many of our schools do not necessarily have those positions. And so it falls on the shoulders of the administrator, who typically is a superintendent/principal. So part of that professional development is to also help educate those individuals in how to better deliver CTE to students, counseling, guidance.
Absolutely. So not just the technical education components, but also the supporting components, the pieces around really helping a young person to understand the options available, and providing them with the tools to have agency and make decisions for themselves.
Correct.
Absolutely. All right, before we move on to our next question, do we have any questions from the audience around how those Perkins V funds should be used, or how our panelists use those in their particular communities? All right. Well, let's move on to the application process then. The application process can be daunting. There's a lot of different steps and pieces that go into this. And as someone who loves planning, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the planning process for this. So how you actually set yourself up for success to be able to effectively put together this application and then get the funds that are going to help to support your programming and your students. So Jerry, could you talk us a little bit through what your application planning process looks like for Perkins V funding to be able to garner those funds for professional development, for alignment to the career connected learning?
Absolutely. I think in order for you to effectively use your funds, you need to understand the needs of your region. And so the first step is needs assessment. And in our region, we developed 5 goals around needs assessment, and that's a result of looking at data, number one. And that data can be in the form of CTE data and how they perform on the state testing. A second piece of that could easily be your LMI data, which is your labor market information. So if you're looking at starting new programs of study, then we look in Oregon at high wage, high demand. And so what's practical to start if you're going to start one? And where is the economic development going to be in that? So needs assessment around several areas. Obviously, how are we serving our underserved population, underrepresented populations, and what does it look like? So there are a lot of opportunities to develop goals around what the needs are in your region, even one as broad as ours. 33,000 square miles, even though they're very rural, my counties have different needs. And so we have to condense those. So we look at that, and then from that, we can develop some of the PD opportunities I mentioned, and we can also then develop some other ways to get information to our teachers about the LMI data and other career connected learning data pieces that we use to support why we do things.
I want to dig in a little bit more on that, Jerry. Needs assessment is such a great way of really starting to
worry about Mario's.
hone in on the different areas that you can focus on. So you talked about data and using data. Where are you pulling that data from? And also, who else is involved in that needs assessment process?
And so one of the biggest pieces of information we get is a result of some surveys that we send to every teacher, administrator, guidance personnel, everyone in the region. And we did that several years back, so we were continually using that information. That's one area, but we also have Northwest Regional Lab, Education Lab, actually has that data. And they also have data relative to what each district does in performing with CTE and also accelerated learning, which if you're familiar with some of that, that involves dual credit, which is also a component of career technical ed. And so we actually have some areas to draw from that really support our efforts in what we're doing with data.
That's excellent. So really tapping into the resources within your community as well, those that might be aggregating some of this data and ensuring that you're using both what is kind of in-house as well as what's externally available to you.
That's correct. And we also use some other data relative to aptitudes. And we have the aptitude dashboard that each of our schools who participate in aptitude work can access, that really tells them a lot about the talents of their students and may create some direction in what they can do in terms of developing programs to support that.
Excellent, excellent. We're going to dig into aptitude a little bit in the upcoming questions as well. So those of you who've got a little taste of it, but this is an area that Jerry is very passionate about, and we're excited to dip into a little bit through the course of this. Alex, could you tell us a little bit more about what your planning process looked like at Chicago Public Schools?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll speak to it from the perspective of a WBL manager, because we are a part of that process, but we don't lead it In Chicago Public Schools, it was led by the CT director and our budget operations team. I think the biggest takeaways that I learned as part of that process is budget much more time than you think is necessary. The amount of data collection, propositions, strategy that goes into it is overwhelming and immense. And there are just a lot of potential breaks in the chain. If you start late or you try to go on a sort of condensed timeline, your funding application is just not going to be where it needs to be. And in terms of procedures, and I know this is dipping into the next question, so I won't get too much into it, you really have to involve the right people in that process. WBL managers, folks who oversee the CTE, pathways, teachers, if you can, elevate student voice. I think that's something that's often missed in these processes. Really survey the end users, which is in this case in students, and understand their needs and write that directly into the application. You'd be surprised how much traction you can get through strategies of that nature. But for those of you who are WBL managers or coordinators or specialists in your district, it's so important to have your data systematized in a way that you can easily pull the information that the team that's leading those funding charges will need. Things like overall numbers of engagement, number of partners, by programs within the WBL continuum, how many are you doing? If you have any sort of geographic location by zip code, all of that can be extremely important. So having an underlying system for your data architecture is almost a must for the pre-planning before you really get into the application process itself.
Excellent. And Alex, you can absolutely go there. Talk us through some of the challenges that you face when applying for funding. So you started to allude to some of them in terms of kind of best practices, but talk us through what those challenges actually are, because I think a lot of our audience members have experienced them. They've felt them. They've felt those pain points. So maybe talk us through what they are and how you've kind of navigated or mitigated some of those.
So you heard me reference a number of stakeholders, and actually someone in the comments said business partners. Yes, please involve business partners because industry is so integral to CTE and so intertwined into the work that we do. That said, you have to be very careful about too many cooks in the kitchen. You do need a lead decision maker. You do need someone who is willing to say yes or no, and really the ability to prioritize. If everything is important, nothing is important. So although you're gleaning a lot of data and analytics and qualitative research, interviews, discovery, all that sort of stuff, you really need to prioritize what is important to your district based not just on what you feel and what you know, but the information you're able to garner from conversations with all of those stakeholders, business partners, students, teachers, principals, the WBL specialists, the CTE director, whoever is really integral to that planning process. You also, if you haven't already, you need to create an underlying data architecture. And there's a few reasons for that. One, as you're planning, you do need to pull out data as it relates to, in my case, it was all as work-based learning, but enrollment, attendance, all of those sort of key factors that they're going to look at that you can speak to. But subsequently, you need to set your data architecture up for success so that you're able to pull the necessary data when Perkins comes asking for how did things go, please show us results, outcomes, outputs. And there's a level of complexity that goes into that architecture. I can speak from personal experience. We did build out a custom system at CPS, and it's probably one of my biggest regrets at my time at CPS is we didn't we have now transitioned into a non-custom built CRM and WBL tracker, but custom built systems, although can be really great because it captures every workflow and every single nuance and everything you do in your district. The problem is custom systems can break. And unless you have a dedicated system engineer or a team of system engineers, which most districts cannot afford, even CPS, we could not afford that. Someone on your team is going to put on that hat without the right experience, knowledge, and long-term it will suffer. although when you adopt a CRM or a SaaS platform, you may give up some of the customization or specification you could do with a custom-based system, the end results, which you get from it, the pros outweigh the cons tremendously. And I say that from personal experience. And additionally, if you're using pen and paper and Excel, those simply do not scale. Even if you're only serving 2,000 students, if you're serving 500 students, those things do not scale. It's very hard to pull analytics, reports, to do analysis. And so you really have to key in on that. And the other thing, just to harp on data, is you have to consider all of the folks who are going to be asking for that information that pertains to Perkins. Even if it's not the feds themselves, even if it's not Perkins themselves, the state, local leaders are going to ask for outcomes and outputs as it relates to Perkins and CTE. You have to structure your data architecture to meet all those needs. And sometimes those asks are conflicting. And so once again, it goes back to that prioritization. What are you able to track and why? But if you have a strong lead, someone who's very analytical and is able to sort of create a hierarchy of needs, who's able to take all those cooks in the kitchen and push out those ones that not are important, you're going to put yourself in a good position to receive funding and receive it in a way that benefits students, which is the penultimate goal there.
Thank you, Alex. That was super helpful. And I think I'm going to ask a follow-up question because I don't think everybody on the call might be familiar with some of the terminology you're using. So could you just kind of give us an explanation of data architecture? Because I think that this is a critical component that you're bringing forward in terms of really setting yourself up for success and sustainability, and kind of the long term of having the scale. So could you tell us a little bit more about what that is for those that might not be as familiar with that term?
Yeah, I'll tell you exactly the object hierarchy that we built within CPS as it pertains to work-based learning. We had 4 levels to our object hierarchy that allowed us to do analysis, data exports in a way that met the needs of Perkins, CTE, and all of those federal, local, and state leaders that were constantly asking us for data. So we started at the top with what we would call a WBL program. That could be something like 2022 summer internships, 2018 guest speaker week, our large scale events, or we would group all of our guest speakers for the year into a single bucket. And we did that very strategically and intentionally because we were doing analysis on the work-based learning continuum, right? From exploration, awareness, and experience. Underneath that, we would track hosts. So, okay, we have our 2022 summer internships. Who are the hosts? Is it JP Morgan Chase? Is it Google? Is it a small urban farm on the west or the south side? And we would track information about the host, the lead contact, the address, any sort of specific, and when we had external links connected to it, our external links in there. Underneath that, we would have what we would call slots. Okay, JP Morgan Chase is doing summer internships, but they're taking an IT student and they're taking a business student. That is where it would basically be the job posting, you could call it, right? So we capture all the details, the schedule, the details of the opportunity, anything related that the student needed to know or the teacher who was nominating them, we would put it down to that level. And underneath that, we would have what we call the attached student level. That was connected to the contact object for students. And that's where we track all of the relevant data of a student attached to the experience. Their time logs, did they complete an onboarding? Who's the teacher of record? Anything that my team needed. And that's really was one of the most important data exports that we did was our attached students export. So we built all of that into a Salesforce platform, and we utilized that to do multiple layers of analysis and data exports. And it was not perfect. There's a lot of that. I could go for hours talking about what worked with it and what didn't. But that's the sort of in-depth object hierarchy and data architecture that you need to build out. And once again, I'm speaking as a WBL coordinator manager, that you'll need to be successful in your Perkins applications. And then if you do receive that funding on the back end, when you have to show success and renewals, and then, you know, the mayor comes asking, what did you do with this funds? How did it work? How many students were served? And if you are just tracking that in Excel or pen and paper or what may have you, you're going to be in for a bad time. And once again, although we built it out as a custom system in Salesforce, that was a big regret of mine. I wish we'd adopted a SaaS system because we were using third-party apps to do really creative things, but those would break with updates. And I would have to put on my engineering hat, and I'm not a developer, and I have to figure it out. And oftentimes I couldn't. And we would lose key functionality at critical times, and it was a real pain. Although the data architecture was sound, many SaaS programs that do WBL, like Transio, have those in place already, and you just adopt them without having to worry about having a back-end developer to ensure nothing breaks.
Thank you, Alex, for going there and going into depth a little bit more. I really wanted our audience to get a better understanding of what that data architecture looks like, how the design of it, how you can kind of design it, because it is, I mean, data is such a critical part of Perkins V, both in garnering the funding as well as then being able to demonstrate the impact. So it's really critical as we think through the infrastructure of our programs and how to set ourselves up for success, particularly in relation to Perkins V. So thank you for taking us there and giving us a bit more in-depth example of what that looked like at Chicago Public Schools. Before I move on to kind of the application of the funding, Jason, do you have any questions for us in terms of how to apply for funding, the challenges that we experience there?
Sure, just a few questions from the chat room here. A clarifying question. I thought Perkins funds could only be used for teacher PD, so I hear that it could be included for administrators and counselors. Is that correct?
So Jerry or Alex, can you speak to that a little bit more about if funds can be applied for professional development outside of teachers specifically?
Yeah, I would say that primarily that is the case, is to be used for teachers, but I think given some of the ruralness of what we deal with and being able to expand, because some of those folks have different roles, not just as an administrator or a counselor, we're able to juggle that a little bit.
So people who wear lots of different hats.
That's correct. In our schools, we very seldom, matter of fact, I'm trying to think of some, my bigger schools have counselors, but 18 of my schools that are considered 1A do not. And so that administrator may take over some of the teaching role, some of the counseling role, and some of those things. And again, I think it's important that we try to educate those who are making decisions in CTE to support those who are delivering it. And so we can do some of that with PD.
Right. Jerry,
if I can add to that, although I did not lead the professional development for the CTE teachers, CPS's interpretation of Perkins funding is we could serve non-CTE entities as long as CTE folks were served. For example, for transportation, Perkins funding would help us pay for buses. We would, on those buses, take non-CTE students to events, but as long as there was a percentage of CTE students on board, our legal department gave us the okay to use those funds. Now, that was CPS's interpretations. Obviously, check with your law departments and all of that. I am not a lawyer, disclaimer. But that's how we got creative with involved. And the same thing for our PDs, as I understood, we opened it up to all teachers. It didn't change the funding or the costs. As long as the focus was CTE, but we were allowing other folks to join, it didn't run afoul of the rules as we understood it.
Awesome. Thank you, Jerry and Alex, for those insights of how we could really broaden and be able to serve beyond both CTE students as well as CTE teachers, while still ensuring that we are aligning to the requirements of the funding. Excellent. Any other questions kind of on that application process? Anything else lined up for us, Jason?
Yeah, another question from the chat, I think is important. How much is regional labor data / forecasted demand by sector / role weighted or required?
Jerry or Alex, any insight into this?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, Oregon's actually now going to what's called integrated guidance and bringing in all these initiatives that are in our state together under one umbrella, and CTE is one aspect of that. And consequently, since we're going that direction, one of the pieces that we're required to have is the labor market analysis and the labor market information, which impacts tenure growth in the economic sector. And so we're actually required now, with integrated guidance and where we're going with that, to have some of that information available to all of our schools.
Yeah, we also use labor market data in CPS. The last time we did an analysis, I want to say it's 2020, 2021. And we found that IT, health, and manufacturing are the highest growth markets areas within the Chicago region. We didn't use that to as like the sole marker of how funding would be allocated, but it was really important when it comes back to that prioritization piece, because it ties to outcomes. And those outcomes at the end of the day, especially in CTE, are placing students in high wage stable careers. And you can't really do that without being able to forecast the future of the market. So we did use that in terms of programs, to help prioritize programs that we'd fund, building out new programs in schools. But within CPS, there's a lot of autonomy for individual schools when it comes to CTE. So we had to balance what we as central office were seeing our labor market data with specific needs of communities within Chicago, which could be very different and vast. So it's a balancing act, and you're going to see, depending on if you're a large urban school district or a smaller school district, that will vary. Even the resources do the analysis itself. But we also try to look beyond Chicago at national trends, understanding that not all of our students would stay in the city, although we wanted to drive economic output in the city itself. The students were our main priority, so we balanced local market analysis with trends we were seeing on the national level.
Excellent. Thank you both. All right, I'm going to move us on to kind of the next section of questions. And again, we will have 5 to 10 minutes at the end to hopefully address any questions we haven't been able to so far. If for any reason we can't get to your question, please follow up with us directly. We will provide contact information so that you can follow up with us. Myself, I'll also see if we can extend our panelists contact information just in case there are more questions that come up for you. Okay, so we've talked about how to get the funding, the application process, how we go after that, some of the challenges we might face. Now I want to talk a little bit more about how we actually use that funding when we get it, how we apply it. So if a teacher is looking to use Perkins V funding, what process or criteria would you recommend putting into place to ensure that you're getting the most out of those funds and are driving the greatest impact as aligned to your goals and your strategy and the community's needs? So Alex, could you tell us a little bit more about what process or criteria you'd recommend putting into place to then determine how you actually distribute or allocate those funds to teachers? Oh, you are on mute, sir.
It's always going to happen one time, right?
Of course.
You're going to hear me go back to this a lot. And this may be very influenced by my role at CPS and what I believe is important. But first off, it has to be data driven. When you're allocating funds to teachers or involving them in the process, you do want them to prove effectiveness, right? And that can be through student voice, that can be through data, but it does need to be a systemized process. And that process should be standardized and transparent. Everyone should be going through the same process, and you should open up that process as much as possible. Don't hold back your reasonings, publish them as much as you can, have internal meetings with folks. You'll find that even if people are not approved or it doesn't go the way they want, if you're transparent with your decision-making, you can sort of stave off a lot of the criticism and complaints that you would have if you do it behind closed doors, which us as central office, I include myself in that, can sort of lean towards, not because we want to keep it out of teachers' hands, but because it's just more work. But if you build out that sort of standardization ahead of time, makes it a lot easier. Obviously, embrace the student voice. I think in all areas of programming, and we did not always succeed in this, but we did try and elevate what students wanted. We did not try to develop a top-down approach. We really wanted to include students in the decision-making. That could be creating a student advisory council when it comes to Perkins. I've seen that happen with great success. Now it is an extra amount of work. Who's going to lead it? Who's going to set the agenda? What does that look like? How do you spark teens into conversations? Not all easy questions to answer, but when it's done right, not only can you get some points from Perkins and all of that, there's the non-altruistic sort of view to it. The students really benefit, and it's a work-based learning program in itself to involve them in that. And the other thing I would say is embrace innovation. Do not do the cookie cutter, oh, well, we've been doing this for years. Teachers come to us with some really, hey, I remember some of the agriculture teachers getting into aquaponics and really like high level agriculture techniques that I knew nothing about, but that willingness to embrace innovation really grew those programs. We were seeing better outcomes. We were seeing more students matriculate into those areas because they were excited. Industry was very excited because we were following trends. We were being innovative. And on the work-based learning side, we embraced innovation in regards to programs that may have been a little off the beaten path, maybe didn't fit into the calendar that I created or sat a little outside the continuum. But as long as that teacher was able to prove to us using data or student discovery or bringing in industry partners, the effectiveness of this, we would often experiment. And we were not afraid to fail. And what we found is that embracing of innovation often led to the most exciting programs in the district and ones that would grow exponentially. So I would just really, starting with that transparent and standardized application process, embracing innovation, and then really bringing in student voices and data to ensure that process is from top to bottom, well aligned across, and I'm using my product lingo, but users, right? Whether that's students or teachers, industry partners, and then you're aligned across the district from those top level, the CEO, the superintendent, whoever leads your district down to the students.
And I just want to say, I really appreciate that it is, utilizing a standardized, systematized process that's criteria-based and data-driven, but also leaning into the necessity for innovation and leaning into the opportunity to try things and fail and learn from that experience. So I really like the balance of that, of really creating the structure to be able to move through this in a systematic way, while also creating a structure that allows for the innovation, pushing beyond status quo, the things that might allow us to truly drive impact in ways that we haven't in the past. Jerry, what about you? I know that you have some really excellent kind of criteria and questions that you ask when assessing different opportunities to determine whether or not it's aligned to the strategy of your region and what it is that you're trying to achieve. So could you walk us through kind of how you do that assessment, what those questions are that you're asking or criteria that you're using to determine whether or not it's going to align and drive impact?
Sure. Well, obviously, our system, our process is going to be streamlined considerably more than maybe what Alex alluded to, because we don't have the funding that you have in larger areas like Chicago and some of the bigger regions. In this particular region, we have a very, very limited amount of funding, and I will tell you, it's less than $200,000. And so spread that out over 23 school districts, you have a streamlined process. So what we do, and actually what I do before I even develop the budget, is I put out a request for proposals or a request for funds, and they're connected to our 5 regional goals. And so if you're going to request funds, whether it be for professional development, equipment, whatever the case might be, then it has to align with one of those particular goals or several of those goals. And then you complete the form. And it also includes things like, one of the things you forget a lot of times when you're doing grants and some of these funding streams is you forget the hidden costs. So if I'm going to buy a welder, am I aware that I may have to upgrade my electrical power to that welder or my ventilation system or some of those things? So we include that in the form, and we want to connect it to vision. What is your overall vision for your program, and how does this support the vision that you're trying to accomplish? So again, once those come in, they're reviewed, and we take a look at obviously where that totals to see how many of those we can honor. And in most cases, we can honor a large majority, if not all of them, because again, most of it's centered around my teachers wanting to have professional development. And we provide 2 of those in region, in district, 2 opportunities for professional development where people meet and collaborate and do some of those things. But PD outside of the region is typically where most of the request is, so they can become a little bit more educated in their trade and what they're trying to do. So that's really our process. And again, it's so streamlined because we don't have a lot of funds to meet the needs of our kids. I will tell you, I didn't mention it earlier in the introduction, what really differs in rural Oregon, particularly this region, is that we have 23 school districts, as you're aware of. All 23 have agriculture. Of those 23 with agriculture, 13 of them, that's all they have. So when you're talking about innovation and exposure and getting kids to become aware of what else is out there, that innovation has to really be critical piece of that for us to be able to change the traditional paradigm that we're all used to in public schools. And so that's the challenge, and that's what we look at. Some of our process is how are we meeting that need through some of providing other opportunities for our kids. So that's our process.
Thank you so much for that, Jerry. And I know this is going to be shocking to everybody because it's shocking to me, but we only have 8 minutes left in our webinar today. So I am going to just kind of ask one final question to you both, and then I'll open it up to the audience for any final time that we do have. But we've been talking about the process and how we could apply it. And so I'm wondering if we could close out with any advice that you have for using Perkins V funding for career exploration, for course materials and resources, professional development, innovation, just any advice that you have for us and how you can apply those funds for some of the kind of activities and things that we've been discussing. So final advice from you, Jerry, for our audience of how they can apply those funds to their greatest needs in career and technical education, or to some of those innovative areas you were referencing.
Well, I like the term that Alex continues to use, and that's innovation. I believe that if we continue to operate the way we've always done and expect different results, even though we have a different customer, we're not going to see a change in those results. And so innovation, even though we don't have a lot of money to work with, we're beginning to focus more on career-connected learning through awareness, exploration, preparation, and training. And we're directing a portion of our funds to opportunities for young people to become exposed to other career options based on their aptitudes and not just their interests. One of the things that I discovered as a high school administrator long ago was that students at the end of 4 years still can't tell you effectively what they want to do. And some of the data beyond that, post-secondarily, even supports that. And so we've attempted to be innovative in this region by focusing on aptitudes, exposing students to their talents, not just their interests, because in rural Oregon or in rural America, your exposure gap is significant. And they don't know what they don't know. So what do we do to expose them to talent and then begin to develop programs around that particular talent, whether it's in health science, computer science, business, education, manufacturing, whatever that might be. But we want to expose our young people to what they are born with, not just waiting at the end of the curve, where typically in most of our schools, that's where ASVAB comes in, which is an aptitude battery provided by the armed services. And then all of a sudden, young people understand some of their skill sets. We need to do that sooner. That's part of the innovation. That's part of using some of these funds for career-connected learning and looking at options to support them other than maybe just that one program of study, which is prevalent in our region.
Excellent. Thank you, Jerry. And I think that that was an insight for me, the differentiation between the interests and the aptitudes, and really thinking about just the level of exposure and access that young people do have to different opportunities, to seeing what's out there. And if we're not seeing it, we can't be interested in it. And so really getting more to the heart and core of what those skills are and those aptitudes are, that can help young people to be exposed to and see things beyond their communities. Alex, what about you? Any kind of closing advice for our audience here today?
I really like to fill the gaps, lean into those things that are stopgaps for programs. Like we would often use Perkins, like, we have a site that's going to take 300 kids, but we can't get them there. So we would use it to fund transportation. We would fill in funding gaps when it came to supplies and trainings. And, to echo what Jerry and I continue to say, to embrace innovation. Trainings, certifications, things that are going, and innovative work-based learning programs that are really going to move that needle forward. The other thing that I particularly think is very important and is a creative use of Perkins funding is helping to fund data tracking systems. I think that districts often balk at the costs or the need when it comes to, well, why do I need a system for, and once again, I'm putting my WBL hat on, for work-based learning. And I would always make the argument, I said, well, all of these folks who are tracking graduation requirements and, we have a student information system. Well, right now in this day and age, WBL is being elevated. It's not college for all anymore, it's post-secondary for all. But my college folks have systems to track their applications, their recommendations, and the graduation requirements. Us WBL folks are often left out in the cold, but we're being expected to scale and to drive partnership engagement. You cannot do that without an underlying system that can automate processes, that can do high-level reporting, so you can do analysis and engage in continuous improvement. So something that I would constantly push for is, let's use this to fund a SaaS or the build out of a custom system. The other one, and this is just a very, very creative use of funds, that we actually mix CTE with ESSER funds. And unfortunately, because I left, this never fully got off the ground, although I really hope they revisit it. We allocated about $5 to $10 million between ESSER and Perkins to do the build out of a dedicated work-based learning center. And that goes back to scaling and innovation. What we realized is that having a dedicated space with sponsored spaces and then rotating spaces in partnership with industry would allow us to serve the entire district, to have field trips, to serve the K through 12 space and work-based learning. So looking at those high-level projects that can, we can't afford it just with the school budget, but we can fill it in with different grants. Those are the types of things that I'd very much encourage you to think about: big picture, outside the box, innovative ways to be spending Perkins funding.
Awesome. Well, Jerry and Alex, thank you so much for your time with us today. If we were not able to get to your questions, we will be sending a follow-up email tomorrow. Please feel free to respond, reach out to us. We'd love to continue this conversation. And Jason, if you wouldn't mind showing that last slide with the registration information. As we mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of a 4-part series of webinars that we will be hosting Transio with eDynamic to help to increase knowledge around career and technical education, work-based learning, scaling, and helping students to really graduate ready. So please feel free to visit this. We would love to see you at upcoming sessions. Let us know if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.